the wishy-washy, Mr. Wishy-washy. When we're looking at our norm reference data, the decisions that we make, they're not always clear cut, right? The decisions aren't always clear cut. So in the previous section, I've hopefully illustrated and provided some compelling evidence that these data aren't always completely accurate. Now, to layer on top of that, these decisions that we're making, they're not always clear cut, right? Okay, bringing in a new concept. Let's take a deep breath and kind of refocus on this new area, this new topic. Let's think about what these tests were designed for, okay? These tests, they were designed for showing an individual's relative standing compared to their group, okay? They were designed to rank order a group of individuals. So when we give these tests, they're designed to get some level of the normal distribution. These tests were not designed to show one group of people who have a certain characteristic and another group that have another characteristic. These tests were designed to show a spectrum of ability. All right. So, if you looked at typing speed, for example, you would see, down here, it'd be, a handful of words a minute. For most of us, it'd be, I don't know what it is, 30 or 40 words a minute. And then for the few of us, it would be 60, 80, 100 words a minute. We see this scale of ability. If we look at running speed, anything, any type of performance, we see this normal distribution. And that's what our norm reference tests were designed for. Now, when we're using them and identifying a cut point, what we have to do is draw a relatively arbitrary line on that distribution to say where we think below is impaired and above is not impaired, okay? And so at what point is performance significantly different from your peers? If we're going back and looking at this, at what point on this normal curve do we see a significant difference between the individual with a disorder and their typically developing peers? And that's really not a clear question, right? What is significant? It's all over the place. So in the research criteria, when we look in the research literature, generally they use a criterion of 1.25 standard deviations below the mean. When I worked in the clinical setting, sometimes we would use 1 standard deviation below the mean. If we think about this 1.25 standard deviations, we can recognize that about 7.5% of the population has a language disorder, and that we also need to recognize that many of these kids do not receive services, right? So in general, when we look at more of an academic setting, historically in Wisconsin, we used 1.75 as our criterion. And a very common criterion when you look across states that have established criterion is something like 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. I personally like 1.5 standard deviations, if a test is appropriate and I'm getting an accurate data, but at the end of the day, these are all relatively arbitrary, right? There's nothing magical about 1.25, 1.5, 1.75. They're different places where that line was placed on the normal curve. Are these numbers accurate, right? So we've already talked about the many potential biases that can be influencing those numbers and those decisions. There's also acknowledged imprecision built into these tests, right? So the test developers, they acknowledge that these tests are imprecise. So even with students and children who are perfect candidates to take the test developers acknowledge there is imprecision, that they're imprecise. So they provide things like confidence intervals and standard error of measurements. And I would love to go into the differences and how these are developed and what they tell you, but I'm just going to lump these together as, confidence intervals, standard errors of, the range of ability we might expect based on the error within the test. Okay. So when we're giving these tests, we need to acknowledge where these numbers are coming from and that they aren't always that precise. Now, I think these things like confidence intervals and standard error, they can be a good tool to let you know the range of performance we might expect, but they're just one thing, just one more tool. So how do I approach this? How do I approach, without using some sort of arbitrary cut point, how do I approach interpreting standard scores? So I go through a series of questions like, was this test appropriate? Is it giving me informative information? Was it designed to do what I was looking for? So for example, I'm part of an interdisciplinary diagnostic team that does that gives the ADOS for autism diagnostic sessions. And in our group's opinion, the ADOS is appropriate for that task. And it has good properties when used appropriately. Like the example I gave before, if I went in with the Peabody to identify a language disorder, I'd be much more skeptical about the appropriateness of that test. All right, so if I've given a test and it's appropriate, are we seeing performance that's clearly high? I got good results and I'm getting clearly high performance. Am I seeing performance that's clearly low, or am I seeing something that's in between, right? So what does it look like when performance is clearly in that higher range or in that normal range? So, a student may score on the low end of normal, maybe 0.75 standard deviations below the mean, give or take 0.2 based on the confidence interval. I have confidence the tests were valid, the data were valid. I'm starting my clinical decision process and saying this looks like a student who is not going to qualify for services. And importantly, I get that converging data from those other sources. So, maybe the teacher says, hey, he's not the strongest students, but certainly, there are students who struggle more. Maybe I'm looking at the academic record and I'm seeing a similar type of performance where a student's at the low end of normal, but, that's consistent with my testing. Also, we may see when performance is clearly low. A student scores quite low on one of our norm reference tests, and I have confidence that those data are accurate. And again, I'm looking for that converging evidence. Is the teacher also noting these struggles? Are they receiving other types of special education services? And is the teacher reporting other aspects where I can see the educational impact? And I'm going to come back to that because for this particular student, that is what I'm really interested in. I'm interested in that for all my students. But, really in this example that I'm giving here, if those, test data are accurate, they really give very limited information for me. What I really need to see is the academic impact, which I'm not seeing with that norm reference test. Now, what about those students who are in the middle? They're scoring beyond the low end of normal, not in the lowest percentiles, around that 1.5 standard deviations, give or take. Right? This is where we really have to use our clinical problem solving. What are the converging evidence? What does my dynamic assessment look like in my language sample? And importantly, what is that educational impact? And again, I think this is such a wonderful tool for us to use to really show how these data look across each of these different aspects of the comprehensive assessment. So I'm going to have one more section here. I left myself about 15 minutes. I do see, I can't see what's in the chat, but I do see the chat. This apparently got a few more thoughts. If there's a question that could be answered quickly and is relevant, I'd be happy to field it, or Andrea could field it.
Well, I think that what was discussed was like looking at, well, are there lists of tests that kind of do some of this homework for you about the sensitivity and specificity, that sort of thing. And so there's that Virginia Department of Ed, graphic, John, I know that you're familiar with. And so I just shared that. And then I also was just told that that rubric you just shared that we adopted from Virginia also was just put on the website too. And I just want to be clear, it's a guideline.
Yes.
Those are for you to gather your thoughts. It's not, those are guidelines. Those are not what the rule is. The rule doesn't say you have to fit a certain number, but you were looking for patterns and we're looking for moderate or substantial impact in the schools.
Yes. So one thing I'll say for the first question, finding good consistent and finding good, consistent data about the consistency and the reliability of norm reference tests is very difficult. Okay, so Andrea gave guidance to the Virginia document. That's a really nice document. When I look through it, most of those tests look pretty good to me. Now, some may be a little bit better than others, a little more appropriate than others. Now, what was the other guidance document that was the something project where they reviewed tests in detail?
The Leaders Project that we talked about a little bit. Yeah.
Yep. But then there's another thing called the Leaders Project, and they do a really good job of going in depth with all of the tests and their strengths and their limitations. Now, at the end of the Leaders Project, when you look at it, every test says it's bad, right? I don't remember the exact term they use, but it doesn't meet the very stringent criteria that they have. I don't know how useful that is either, right? So, there are some tools available. There are some of those central tools available. There's stuff that's going to be shared. For me, as a clinician, so this isn't, official guidance or anything. For me as a clinician, most modern tests, that early work by Plant and her colleagues put them to the test of making sure that they are documenting the psychometrics of their tests. Most modern tests that are widely used have pretty good reliability, pretty good validity. Most of them have some biases against students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. I'm not here to endorse any particular test. I think in your own experience, you'll find some that work better than others. All right, this is probably one of my biggest issues with norm reference tests is that oftentimes functional communication is not assessed. So we're going to go back to your own personal, somewhat traumatic experience for a lot of you. Maybe this should be a trigger warning. Does performance on GRE describe your clinical expertise? And I think a lot of you would argue, no, it does not, right? But it's a requirement to get into graduate school. And some places, other places have recognized this limitation. We've recognized some of the limitations. We've removed it as a requirement for getting into our graduate program. So just as the GRE doesn't describe clinical experience, most of our norm reference tests don't describe functional communication. But I'm going to tell you about my favorite task. My favorite norm reference task, sentence repetition. I love it. In general, you get good sensitivity and specificity. There's a lot of research showing that it's not just working memory, that language is involved with sentence repetition. This is a great quote from Clem et al. Sentence repetition appears to be a valuable tool for language assessment because it draws upon a wide range of language processing skills. The most recent study I ran, or one of the most recent studies I ran, was a group of adolescents who were getting speech and language therapy or getting therapy with language goals in the school. I was very confident that they had language disorders. I knew my reviewers were not going to be confident, so I just had them do a sentence repetition task. Why do I like it? We can think about what you need for sentence repetition. You need strong verbal working memory. You need to be able to comprehend and produce complex sentences. You need to be able to include those inflectional morphemes. You need to be able to recall low frequency words, right? And we know these are all things that students with language disorders struggle with. However, what is sentence repetition not looking at? It's not telling me anything about how you actually use complex sentence when you're telling a story, how you're expressing your needs to your peers, how effective you are as a storyteller. It's not telling me any of those things, right? So I think the best way to think about this is to understand how norm reference test items are chosen. How are they selected? This is what I used to think. I used to think that these were super important skills. I used to think it was, like I said in the previous video, if you saw it, I thought they were all developed by some brilliant scientists who just knew the most critical features that you needed in order to communicate and that you should work on in therapy and that you need in order to be an effective communicator. What I've come to learn is that the single most important feature of a norm reference test item is its ability to distinguish between high and low performers. That is what a norm reference test item is designed to do. It's designed to tell you who the individuals are with higher skills or lower skills. And what they use this complicated process called item response theory. And what we could think of down here, this ability level, this is what we can say, this is just general language ability. So strong versus weak ability, not unimpaired versus impaired, even older versus younger. And this is the probability that you get the item correct. So you have a high likelihood of getting this item correct or a low likelihood of getting this item correct. And what we're looking for, what test developers generally do, is have kids, adults, whoever, take tons and tons, hundreds of items, complete hundreds of items, and they see which one is failed, is gotten incorrect by people with lower abilities, and gotten correct by individuals with higher abilities. Okay, so we're looking for items that distinguish between high and low performers. When I first understood this, this was very eye-opening to me, right? These test items, they were chosen because they're good at differentiating the high versus the low performers. So we can look at something like inflectional morphology, and we have decades of research and probably billions of dollars invested into the inflectional morphology of children with language disorders. And we know that whether or not you include or drop your inflectional morphemes, that's one of the strongest indicators of a language disorder, with the big asterisk there that I'm going to get to, right? That's one of the strongest indicators of a language disorder for mainstream English-speaking children who do not speak a dialect such as African American English. All right. But we know that kids with language disorders, if they speak mainstream English, they drop their inflectional morphemes. So that's why we see on tests like the TOLD, again, this is what I had at home, we see tests like this. I found a penny this morning. This afternoon, I found 3 more pennies. That's my best student impersonation. I have a block. If I had another block, I'd have 2 blocks. Eduardo worried about everything. Everyone called him a worrier, or as all the kids would say in the study we used this for, everyone called him a dork, which I don't think is what they were looking for, but it always made me chuckle. So what this is looking specifically at your ability to include those inflectional morphemes. And why is this chosen? Because it distinguishes between kids with higher language skills and lower language skills, kids with and without disorders. This is also a really good example of a test that's biased against students who speak and use African American English or Black English. If we have a student who uses that, they're going to get a lot of those items scored incorrectly, even though it's not an indicator of lower language skills. And when we think of functionality, usually there's a continuum. So one of the things Andrea mentioned in the beginning was decontextualized, and we can contrast decontextualized from functional. So decontextualized means it really isn't capturing your true communication. It's breaking down communication into its individual parts. Functional is actually using your language and speech to communicate. And, something like repeating sentences is very decontextualized, not very functional. Something like describing photosynthesis in science class is very functional. Something like completing morphemes, morphological completion, very non-functional. An examination of a student's writing portfolio is very functional. The Self-5 tends to be less functional. The teacher interview is more functional. Now, there are a couple of these norm reference tests that I would say are kind of in between. So something like the test of narrative language or the TILS, the test of integrated language and literacy skills. That's probably somewhere in the middle. Tasks that I love, like narrative retells and expository language samples, are probably, not quite fully functional, but something trending more functional. Okay. So what are some final things? What are some temptations that we're tempted to do with these norm reference tests? But one thing we're often tempted to do is determine disability based on these norm reference tests alone. We want to do this because we get that objective and accurate data, which hopefully I've made the case isn't always as objective and accurate as we think. I like given tests. I still like given tests. My wife loves giving norm reference tests because they're efficient, they're fun, they're predictable. It's what we, including I, have trained you. I mean, gosh, I saw some students coming in with this, and I trained you to administer these tests. The old criteria, the old rule, the old guidance, the old rule put a lot of emphasis on these norm reference tests, but we need to understand these limitations and look for the educational impact. We're also often tempted to build profiles, right? So we have all of these different tests with these fantastic names: expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, auditory comprehension, expressive language tests, problem-solving tests. It's so tempting to look at relative strengths and weaknesses across these tests. However, again, with the data, hopefully I've convinced you that we can see different patterns of performance across those tests. And honestly, the differences between them usually are not that real. We can even be tempted to look at differences between these individual subtests. So the TOLD has listening, organizing, speaking, grammar, semantics, total language. Again, if we see these subtle differences, oftentimes there's not a lot of reality to those differences. So like I said, usually there's no real differences, and often, now I'm getting to be Mr. Broken Record, often it overlooks that functional communication and the educational impact. We're often tempted to develop goals with norm reference items, right? We know the items that students got incorrect. We know how to reassess them. These developers, they picked really important items, right? Not necessarily. These items were chosen because they differentiate kids, not because they're super important, not because they show educational impact. And now he's just beating a dead horse.
So I just wanted to come back and wrap this up. John will do the case studies as a recording. We are not saying do not use norm reference tests, but it's part of your comprehensive assessment model. So hopefully this highlighted for you today the limitations that do exist with norm reference tests. And hopefully that encourages you, if you haven't previously, which I know many of you are doing a lot of this really good work anyway, but it's just a reminder for us all, the importance of doing these other pieces.